are a big problem for the unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics. So if you have one of these, you're like, we can't fix this in our laws. If you have this is quantum mechanically generated by Feynman's infinite path integral approach. So he just runs the infinite integral, and this is the shape that he gets. And then he takes this manifold and this manifold, and he runs a projection to two of them to match it up. And he shows that you can have a smooth projection from one to the other at a certain radius. And so that's what he does. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to mention that I think it's okay if people are lost on one topic for a little bit, because especially in these beginning ones, you're switching topic often enough.
Yeah, so thank you.
If they're not going to understand it, they're not going to connect with it. That's where we'll connect with a different point.
Right. And some of what I've thought of, so some people have come back to me later, especially some of the youth who said, when you talked about some of this stuff, I didn't understand what you were saying. But when I got to college and I had some professor tell me, this other thing is the case, I remembered that there's a dude out there that sounds at least as smart, maybe smarter than the professor, or at least he knew the stuff as well as the professor did. And he says that's not the way it works. In some cases, that was enough for the kid to say, I don't necessarily have to take this. Other kids, young men, came back and were like, tell me what your idea was about this. And then I'd tell them, like, oh, yeah, that does make sense. So some of this is genuinely just about showing everybody in the room that not all apologists are people who will throw their hands up and be like, I don't understand all this newfangled math stuff, but I'll tell you this, it's not what God would have us do. Right, so that's the point here, is to say, now thinking people who actually understand these concepts will tell you that these concepts, far from detracting from the idea that God exists, significantly reinforce the idea that God exists. So that's why. Yes, sir.
I just mentioned, knowing that we just came from the JC thing last weekend.
Yes.
You're going to have this idea ricocheting back in the minds of people, because we're talking about billions of years old, and other people might have a different conception. You don't want to address that, because you don't need to address that. Yeah. But someone's going to be thinking it. We're going to ask it in the audience during the Q&A.
Yeah, so if they do, I'm probably going to go to Schroeder, because this is my favorite response, which is when people say, "Well, how old is the universe?" My question is, by whose clock? And when people are like, "What do you mean?" And I'll be like, "Well, have you seen it? Like, what percentage of people do you think have seen Interstellar? Is it a low percentage of people, or did almost everybody see that movie?"
I mean, I think most people have heard of it.
But most people haven't seen it. Okay. But if you've seen it, you see, like, these guys go down to this planet surface, this other dude's orbiting the planet, which just doesn't actually make sense the way that they did it. But this other dude's orbiting the planet, and because they end up, like, messing something up, and so they get stuck there an additional 20 minutes, and that correlated to 7 years. So they show back up to this thing, and the dude's been like, I've been waiting on you 7 years, past the time you're supposed to come back. So that time dilation thing, they really call out in Interstellar. So, but in this universe today, if we ran somehow, somehow scientifically we could figure we could teleport ourselves to inside of a black hole, Schwarzschild radius. We could get close to the singularity of the black hole, and we checked a watch there that would have gotten pulled apart. But if we could check the watch there and said, how old is this universe, Mr. Black Hole? Black hole would be like, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes? You'd be like, no. I mean, I'm talking about the multi-billion year. He's like, no, my watch says like we've been around here 21 minutes now. So I think that's a consequence of special relativity. If you asked, actually it wouldn't be 21 minutes, it would be tens of thousands of years. But if you take the first instant of time, and by the way, Hawking agrees with Schroeder on this one. So Hawking turns around and says, there's no point in talking about time, Penrose does as well, prior to matter forming. And their reasons for believing it differ slightly from Schroeder's reasons for believing, but what they're basically saying is there's no way to measure time prior to having mass energy in the equation where matter is actually formed. So if you're Schroeder's point is like, if God's writing Genesis, then he's going to you're going to get it from a heavenly perspective. So God says, I started the universe, this is what happened on day 1, this is what happened on day 2, this is what happened on day 3. And the place where the first place his clock would start running, so to speak, God's clock, God could have a clock there, would be at something like 10 to the negative 35 seconds after the initial expansion of the universe. And then with the each doubling of the universe increases the speed at which, halves the speed at which time rolls per day. If it increases the speed, it halves the amount of time. So in short, day 1 is like 7 billion years. Day 2 is like 3.5 billion years. Day 3, and by the time you get to day 5, you are legitimately, if you're standing back at the initial creation of the universe and you're watching your watch, literally that stuff is happening that fast. Not in some speed up projection, but if that's the clock that you were watching, and you were watching it from that time, so to speak, projection wise, everything would be happening super, super fast, but it would be slowing down. And by the time it hits day 5, you've got Earth and animals and plants and all that kind of stuff. That's the way that it actually works in reality. The reason we are like, but that's not reality. That's because we're stuck in this particular time point when the clock has slowed down a lot. So from the beginning of the universe, the rate that clocks tick changed significantly. And Schroeder's point is like, why should we be doing it from this perspective? We should be doing it from God's perspective. Once he creates man, it makes sense to switch your clock to man's perspective. And so if you use that calculator, use those philosophical assumptions, take God's perspective on time first, and then switch to man's once he makes man, then the earth is 6,000 years old. Literally 6,000 years old. Not like in some young earth creationist by our clock kind of thing, but literally all of that stuff that happens across those billions of years actually happens in 6 days.
So that works with cosmological timeline. What if they drill down and ask you about evolution?
So that's a different topic than the topic that's being debated tonight.
Right.
So do we talk about that or not? So if we do, what I would say is something like, if that question comes up, I'll say, that's not the debate topic tonight, but I'll give you my thoughts on brief thoughts on evolution right now, which is what's the goal of the theist? If the goal of the theist or the Christian is to say the Bible is true and naturalism is false, there are far better arguments that naturalism is false rather than saying Darwinian evolution by natural selection acting on random genetic mutation is improbable to give us what we have here. Like, if you want to make a probability argument, I gave you one facet of 20 better probability arguments that I can make than that. Now, I'll maybe cite Barrow and Tipler and say atheists who've looked at this problem and said, what is the probability that evolution would produce what we produce, come up with numbers that make that 10 to the 10 to the 120th look small. Like theirs is like 2 to the 10 to the 500th power. That's the probability that evolution works in our universe. So it depends on whether you want to talk about probability. Now, my own belief is I wouldn't even argue any of this on an evolutionary perspective. I would argue, like I did, on abiogenesis. Where did the first living, self-replicating life form come from? Because you can't do evolution until you have that. There is no evolution until there can be natural selection, and there can't be any natural selection until you have members of life to select from. Like, there's no such thing as chemical Darwinian evolution. That just does not exist. So you have to get that first cell fully formed by random chance, not by Darwinian processes. And the argument I'm trying to make here is that is so improbable that it's absurd. Like we talk about hydrothermal vents, maybe this formed around there. Forget hydrothermal vents. If you emptied the oceans and stacked it all full with just amino acids and 1,000,000 times a second they're linking against each other in 150 unit chains for 4.6 billion years, it's still a 1 in a billion chance that you get one functional protein out of that. And then if you say, well, most proteins aren't 150 amino acids long, most are 300, and the simplest form of life we know has 2,000 of those. So what's the probability that happens in a world stacked just with amino acids and nothing else in perfect proportion? Like that, don't tell me that that's a scientific statement. If you actually care about science, if you actually care about probability, then you would reject that hypothesis outright and say that's absurd. There's no way I believe in that. Depends on whether you believe in logic and science.
Are we meeting next week?
I think so. Yeah. In fact, I would anticipate next week, if anybody liked the stuff that happens in debate.
Did You said you were off next week?
I was originally not going to be here next week. Turns out, by either divine intervention or divine joke, I will be here next week.
There might be some people who want to talk about
Did you
it.
guys lose?
Yeah, roger that. No. Oh, the tournament? Oh, the hockey stuff was over. That was a possible work-related event. Well, thank you for the feedback. I'll make some of the changes we talked about here. If there's anything else you can think of that you would add, or any other, if you're not a share it in public person, send it to me in email or grab me offline, whatever. But I acknowledge I have the exact same concern you do. I'd much rather do it like this. I just can't. I'm not good enough to do it in that period of time. Yeah. So this is going to be our best stab at it.
Godspeed, all right?
Thank you, sir. Yeah. So.